Hello there, sword friends. Today I'm going to tell you about this sword right here. It is the Dragon King Sea Wave Katana. And before I get into the video, as is customary for me, some disclaimers. First, this is a review sample from the folks at Cast Siberia. Special thanks to Patrick over there for getting this my way for the review. The other bit to note is that I do study Japanese-style swordsmanship. I've done it for a minute. I reviewed swords on the internet for a minute, but I don't fancy myself an authority figure on the subject. So keep that in mind as you hear my ramblings about this sword in particular. Now, the point of this video is to help you determine if it's worth your hard-earned money or not. And to do that, what I'm going to provide is some close-ups of the bits and bobs and fits and features, and I'll remark on those as I go through them. I'll then use it as a practitioner and talk about the experience of doing that. I'll then cut with it in the backyard, pool noodles, water bottles, that kind of stuff, just for fun. And then I'll practice with it in class doing tamashigiri, and so I'll talk on the various uses and what I think of them. And hopefully at the end of that, you have some idea of if it's worth your hard-earned money or not. What I'm not going to do, though, is break it, and that's my typical shtick on YouTube, but I don't think this sword is specifically targeting somebody who's looking for supreme durability. And I'll talk a little bit more on it later, but let me know in the comments section if you think it would be worthwhile to break it. I don't personally think so, but I could be wrong, and if you would find value in me pushing it further than you see in this video, it's something I'm willing to revisit in the future. All right, it's time to move on to the bits and bobs and fits and features, and I'm going to begin with the pommel, the end cap, the kashra right here. And basically, they're really well done. And I'm going to harp on this for a little bit because it goes throughout the whole entire set of fittings. The kashra, the fuchi, the tsuba, the minuki, all of them are really, really well done. Now, these are cast fittings, which means that they are not hand engraved, hand carved out, but they are cast and they're done in great detail, much greater detail than I typically see from any company outside of Hanwei. Dragon King and Hanwei, I believe, are different companies, but they share some of the same tutelage and skill. I believe the person that runs Dragon King has a long history with Hanwei, and what I see here throughout the sword is actually a lot of Hanwei influence. I could mistake it for a different Hanwei product, but this kashra right here, the Subba, the fuchi, the minuki, all of them have the same kind of really detailed castings that I would see on a Hanwei piece. And they're about as top-notch as you can get for fittings that are not kind of handmade and hand-engraved, which incidentally, if you were to have these handmade and have them look like this, it would likely cost a pretty substantial amount of money because there's a lot of fidgety little detail in here. Anyway, that's what I'm seeing. A lot of detail. I see the waves are crisp. The lines between the waves are crisp. There's little brass detailing that is, or gold detailing that's put on here. I don't know if it's gold. I assume it's brass, but some minor color change which pulls your eye away just a little bit, but not too much. Very similar to antique fittings that I've seen, and honestly really well done in terms of the overall shaping, overall detail, and also ergonomics, because while I do kind of feel them, if I hold on to the kashra down here, I can really get a strong grip because there's a lot of little grooves and pits and divots and whatnot in here, which are supposed to be there, not because of flaws. But it doesn't chew up my hands. At no point was it uncomfortable to use. And sometimes the flub of my hand absolutely rubs on the kashra, and I don't feel, or I didn't manage any discomfort while I was using it. So they're at least subdued in a way that hasn't made them sharp. It's overall really well thought out and one of the better sets that I've seen on a mass production sword in quite a while. It also has shiridome on the side, and they are not cast in, which is often what I see. The only downside that I could really note to the kashra is that it did come loose in some of the aggressive use that I put toward it. Now, it didn't happen for quite a while. I used this sword for EI for, well, at least for a few weeks, and I used it almost exclusively. And the kashra didn't come loose. It wasn't until I brought it out, did some water bottle cutting, whacked it on a stand, kind of was a little bit ham-fisted with it, and then the kashra came a little bit loose. Now, it didn't come loose in the sense that the knot came untied, but the glue or adhesive that's underneath it has shaken loose, and now the kashra will move around. It didn't come loose, though, in such a way where it completely came undone and I couldn't recover it. So I can still get glue under here. I can still attach it and it can still work. And I could honestly still use it the way it is, but the kashra is a little bit fidgety and distracting. So this knot could be a little tighter on here, but where it came loose was actually not so bad and still recoverable, which I can at least appreciate that. The other bits to note is that the lines were reasonably well done. They're oftentimes the Ito transitions here and it gets a little bunchy. Even on $1,000 swords, it's not uncommon to see this Ito not really transition particularly well. And this one did. It came out overall pretty nice. And that brings us to the handle, the ska, the rest of the bit. I'm going to talk about the Ito first. So it has this blue Ito, which is thematic with the sea wave theme. And it's actually tied reasonably tight. I would call this a good level. At $1,000, your expectations are high. This doesn't move around. Now, I don't think I could put all my weight on one knot and have it not move at all. It will move slightly, but very, very little. I would say that for in the realm of mass production swords, this is really an excellent level of tightness. It doesn't move really much over the Minuki, and in some other places it feels really like rock hard, which is fantastic. The other bit is the shape of the handle here. This is something that I've appreciated. It has a kind of slight egg shape to it, so it's a little bit thinner where your knuckles are on the edge side. It indexes really well. It locks into your hand really well. It thins down at the kashra end too, and is a little bit thicker over here by the Subba area, the crossguard area. And overall, I just find it indexes really well. I can kind of tell right where my hands are. It naturally locks into place. I feel like I'm really connected to the edge. I can't say that it really helped my cutting very much, but I did overall like the shape of the handle. It feels like they've learned some lessons from the Hanwei days. Some Hanwei handles can be really, really small. Some can be axe handles. This is a very solid dance between those two things. Down at the end, it's a little bit thin. Up at the top, it's a little girthier, but not so much that it feels like I'm holding an axe handle or a hockey stick or something kind of juvenilely shaped. And down at the end, it also doesn't feel like it's too thin and it's going to fall apart. This is overall a really elegant shape and one that I appreciate. It's not common to see something shaped this well, again, even in this price point. The skin on here is not particularly well done. It doesn't stand out as a particularly high nodule skin or a large grain skin. That's an opportunity, I suppose, to use nicer skins on here. It is a nicer sword, so you might expect something a little nicer than what I might see on a lesser sword, but that's a pretty small thing. Minuki as well, they're well cast. I would say that the kind of golden wave on the back is lesser cast. It doesn't seem to have as much detail, and the gold detailing is applied a little less elegantly than on some of the other fittings. But the wave over the moon or sun fitting here is really clean and nice, and the way the Ito transitions up to the Fuchi as well is really well done. Now the Fuchi is just like the Kashra, really well done, has an elegant wave theme, and again, nothing bit into me. It has some really kind of crisp ledges on here, but nothing that was uncomfortable, and the fat of my hands does often drift up towards the Fuchi. I do feel it, but again, at no point was it at all uncomfortable, and I think it overall is really, really handsome and really well done. I'm not honestly a huge fan of the wave theme. It's kind of generic. It's like dragons on the sword for me, but this particular set is kind of strong and whimsical at the same time. I just like the way it's done. It's a little bolder, and at the same time, I don't know, it's just a little bit more fun. I really like the execution of the wave theme on this particular sword. The little brass detailing, how it flows to the Fuchi. A lot of times people also phone it in on the Fuchi. This one has a lot of crispness and detail on it. All of that is really appreciated. Moving up to the Subba, again, you see some great detail here. There's lots of waves, lots of little brass accents, little dots, little speckles from the wave theme. It's also met up with silver seppa, or at least silver colored seppa that have some detailing in them, which I think matches pretty well. I'm glad they didn't just phone it in and put the same brass seppa, these little washer spacers that you see on a number of other swords, that kept it thematically kind of the silver color. It has a sense of bling to it, but it also doesn't pull your eye any one particular direction. Anyway, the wave theme on the Subba, also really well done. I'm not going to harp on it, just the waves are really crisp. I make out all of these little lines. I see very, very few little pocks or imperfections from casting. It's well done. And it also has what appears to be kind of a rim or a raised rim or something around it that just adds a little bit of dimension. Sometimes you make out a seam along here. I don't see any of that. And I like that there's a smooth line of silver around the rim, and also little smooth lines or rims around the Fuchi and the Kashra as well. Thematically, I think this is really well presented and done. The Subba is a little bit on the small side, though. It almost feels like it could be a Wakizashi Subba. I wish it were a little bit bigger, if anything else, but apart from that, it's overall well shaped. And a big Subba isn't necessarily great. It's more to cast, more to deal with, more to have problems with, but it also can get caught in your obi. It's not necessarily the most fun to train with, so I don't mind a small Subba since you're not particularly using this for, at least for protecting your hands. It prevents you from sliding up if you're thrusting, but you don't use the Subba a lot for blocking. And so having a bigger one isn't necessarily super important for what I think most people would probably use this sword for. Moving up to the habaki, it has a silver shape, and this more or less looks like the same brass habaki, but just in a silver color. And I wish that they had some sort of additional wave theme or something on here. I think it's a missed opportunity to bring the wave theme up into the habaki and show some of the casting skills on this blade collar here as well. In terms of does the habaki fit? Well, it does all the things that it's supposed to do. It's reasonably well tensioned, and it does all of that, but the koiguchi is well fit. Unfortunately, there's something in the saya that's preventing the sword from going in all the way. It feels almost like there's a piece of plastic at the bottom of the scabbard, and I'm not sure what it is. I've tried cleaning it out, but it prevents the sword from really going in all the way unless I really just shove it in there. Then the sword goes in, and the habaki does that. You shouldn't do that, incidentally. It really wears things out. It can crack stuff up here, but I can push the sword in all the way and not damage it. But then it gets like stuck in something, and then I have the same kind of problem, and it doesn't fit in all the way, and it feels like it's hitting a piece of plastic down at the end. So I think with training, with using this, I'll probably wear out whatever's running at the end of the scabbard here, and then the habaki will go in all the way, and then by then it will probably need to shim something. But apart from that weird little issue, which I think is, again, maybe why one of these things was sent to me, it seems to fit in just fine and was tensioned reasonably well. Talking about the scabbard a little bit more, there are some horn pieces that are fit in reasonably well up here on the scabbard, and it's not just kind of phoned in, I guess. A lot of times they don't, a lot of companies, even $1,000, don't make this koiguchi area properly, and it's not horn, or it doesn't have the little wooden shims or little wooden slats that slide up that make it a hard thing to make. I do see a reasonably good attempt at making the saya and the koiguchi the way that it's supposed to be fitted on a Japanese sword. Moving down, the kurigata is well formed. It also has silver shirodome in it. They weren't glued in, which means they're kind of flopping about a little bit, but at the same time, some people like them glued in, some people don't. I personally prefer them glued in, but that's something I can address here. On the paint, though, the ito was tied a little bit before the stuff that was dry. The lacquer on here was dry, so I can make out little imprints of the ito where it was tied in the presentation knot. Very common thing that I see. I wish it wasn't done. I think it's something that I might be able to take Mother's Mag or some sort of polish and buff out to some degree, but there is an imprint remaining from the ito tied down before the whatever application of paint was completely dry, or at least not impressionable by tightly tied ito. In custom sword projects, incidentally, when I get a sword project back and it's been lacquered, I'm told, don't tie the ito on maybe for like a month or two, because it will potentially leave imprints. So I imagine they can't just leave the sayas out drying for a month. They probably have stuff to do, and so I imagine it gets tied on a little before it's ready. I've seen this a lot on a lot of scabbards. It's just unfortunate to see it on a $1,000 sword. Worth also noting that the scabbard is really well done. It has, very smooth lines. It's not jittery and bouncy all over the place. It doesn't have a lot of dimension, as in taper. It doesn't taper down, if any, very much. But the paint is also really smooth. It feels like almost wet and slippery in the hand. Not so much that it's actually slippery, but whatever paint they're using on here has a really nice, clean, and smooth texture to it. All right, wrapping up the side, it has a horn kojuri, horn kurigata, horn koiguchi that's reasonably fit. It has also a nice sageo. I wish it were a little bit longer. That's not a dig at Dragon King, though. Most sageo are not quite as long as I'd like them to be in the Toyama Ryu style that I do. They often tend to be a little bit short, and so they sit in my obi a little weird when I tie them down. Anyway, overall, I would say the saya is good. This particular one, again, has some slight blemishes. If you see that, it's not uncommon. Sometimes they buff out. The stopper in this one, though, is kind of the odd part. And so I really hope that anything that you get doesn't have this, and that this is one of the reasons that it was sent to me as kind of a review sample, is because it's, imperfect. Whatever's in there and stopping it is, I don't know, feels like plastic. I've tried cleaning it out again. If yours does this, it would be something I would bring up to Cass and have them sorted out, or whoever you buy the sword from. It ideally shouldn't and should go in all the way. But it's also worth noting that this is the first time I've seen a Dragon King product that does that. I've had a few other Dragon King swords on the less expensive side, and they did not have this problem, and I remember them tensioning reasonably well. So again, probably just one of the reasons that I got this one as a review sample. All right, let's move on to the blade, the pointy stabby part. And there's some stuff to cover here. And honestly, what I'm seeing, the pros and cons are very similar to what I would talk about in a folded, nice blade from Hanwei. So Dragon King shares some of the same opportunities for improvement and the same areas where I would offer praise. So starting with some of the criticism here. One, in the surface is they're ripply. They run around and bounce around on the surface. Not a lot, less than even very high-end European swords, but still on Japanese swords, you often look at these and see smooth as glass, and it's not uncommon to see that on a $300 sword out of Longchuan, China. So seeing surface ripples, particularly in the bohi, is not ideal. Now, it's a sign that somebody actually was whacking on this with a hammer and forging it out, and maybe you appreciate that. But here I see it as an area of opportunity for improvement. What I do see, though, is a really well-shaped sword. A lot of times, swords at a Longchuan, or the same forges that make a bunch of different swords, don't have a lot of deviation in shape. And Hanwei does have just something a little different in terms of curvature, a little different in terms of thickness. It's just a slightly different shaped sword than you see from a lot of the vendors on eBay, and that much is appreciated. Polish-wise, there's some detail here. It's somewhat subtle, and so it comes out in the right light, but it's not particularly zazzy, as I would put it. So it does have a folded pattern on it. You can see it, and you can see the hata in the right light. If you hold it up, there's a lot to appreciate in terms of kind of the various patterns from the folding of the steel. It has a hamon. It's differentially hardened, and there is a kind of an attempt at etching it or zazzing it up so it leaves that kind of opaque white color on the edge of the hamon. But it is also a little bit tough to see and kind of blends in. Depending on the light that you're in, you might be able to see it, you might not. It could be a little bit zazzier in my mind. Now, there are some other elements to the polish as well. And the bohi, it's a mirror polish along the spine. It's a mirror polish. As soon as you get on the bevel side of things, it becomes a little bit more opaque. There's a little bit more attempt to bring out the hata. And as you get to the edge itself, the hamon, there's even more and more effort to kind of distinguish that and bring in contrast. Up at the Kisaki, I see the same kind of thing that I see from Hanwei. It's polished in, but just not particularly well. The Kisaki could be better done. It kind of has the same kind of transition that I commonly see on Hanwei, and that also commonly rubs off and gets bumped around in the scabbards. One thing I do see that's really well done, though, is the termination of the bohi. The fullering here comes off, and it really crisply ends on kind of symmetrically on either side, and I really like that. But again, some of the same things could be said about a Hanwei blade. It looks like many of the same pros and cons that exist on Hanwei are filing over to Dragon King. So the people that work there, or that started the company, or that have familiarity with the Hanwei making sword process are bringing over some of the pros, but unfortunately bringing over some of the cons as well. Anyway, there's not much to say that's bad here. The slight rippling and lack of profound zazziness is not really too much of a bugaboo. The blade as well, really, really sharp, and that is what will bring me to the usage side of things. I can actually talk about cutting with it. But overall, those are the bits and bobs and fits and features. I'm going to move on now to the usage side of things. And in talking about that, I'm going to talk first about doing EI with it, practicing with it. Frankly, it's a nice sword. All of those compliments I gave to the handle about tight ito and being well-shaped really make this a great tool. It's not particularly light. It looks like a dainty thing. It's not. It kind of feels more substantial in the hand, but it's honestly a great training tool. I don't necessarily always want something super light. It feels a little bit heftier than the Hanwei Shinto that I enjoyed practicing with some time ago, but not necessarily in a bad way. I've really enjoyed training with it. The bohi as well makes it swish around quite a bit. But one thing I forgot to mention about the blade is that the Kisaki doesn't swell, which is what I would commonly see in a number of Hanwei swords. It kind of tapers off, and so that lack of swell means that it doesn't make as much noise as it could, but the bohi does make it audible, so I can tell if I'm swinging it correctly. I can tell if my edge alignment is good, and it also has a weight and a feeling to it that doesn't do all the work for me. It's not super light. It doesn't let me go for hours, and if I swing it wrong or clumsily, I will feel the weight and have to recover from it. But it's also not so heavy. It's a reasonably small sword. It's not particularly hefty overall in terms of weight or dimension. It just has a presence to it that forces you to pay attention. So as a training tool, I've really actually enjoyed using it. But if you're buying it with the sense that it's going to be light and kind of dainty feeling like an Iaito is, I I would say it is not the case. This forces you to pay a little bit more attention, and honestly, it is similar to the Hanwei Bushido in that way, in that it feels like a medium kind of sword. It's not particularly light, it's not particularly heavy, it has substance in the cut. At the same time, it makes you work a little bit to recover. So it's overall kind of medium in performance in that way. At least it's funny because I'm doing this in the business of words, and I'm not wordsing very good here, but I would say it is an overall well-balanced sword. It just gives the impression that it's a dainty thing, and it's not. Hopefully the dimensions and all that kind of stuff in the description down below help you, along with the words that I'm saying, kind of get a better mental picture for what to expect when you hold this thing in the hand. I would just say it's a little heftier than what your initial impressions might give you, but not so much that it's a particularly bad thing. All right, now I'm going to talk about the cutting with the sword. And the first place that I cut with it was in class, and it's worth calling out a little bit the targets that I'm using. I'm using used Japanese tatami, and it hasn't been soaked long enough, and it's been dried too long, and so it's among the harder targets to cut, at least in terms of tatami. I also am not a particularly great student, have been showing up to class as rigorously as I would like, so try to disregard me here and focus on what the sword is doing. And the sword is perfectly sufficient to cut. It is sharp enough to do it. It held its edge really well. If I had good technique and good speed, it did the job for me, and it was not a hard thing to use, but it wasn't doing the job for me. If I didn't have reasonable technique, if I didn't have enough power in the swing, it wouldn't cut through. And I noticed that on some of the horizontal cuts, I'm kind of batting it around. I really couldn't get the technique down. The sword was perfectly capable of cutting, but I just couldn't get it. Anyway, it's perfectly capable of cutting, and the edge also held up reasonably well. If I have good technique, good alignment, it sails through the targets. I don't feel resistance, and I'm swinging too hard in a lot of cases. The sword would do some of that work for me, but it didn't do all the work for me. So if I had like a Hanwei XL geometry blade, some of the other students in class use those geometries of blades, it would probably work out quite a bit better for me with what I was doing. It would do some of that work, and the cuts that I failed to execute with this one would probably have worked with a different sword that was purpose-built for tamashigiri. This one, though, is not purpose-built for tamashigiri. At the same time, where it lacks and maybe makes you do a little bit more work and technique, that could be seen as a pro if you're not looking for a tool that does the work for you and forces you to have good technique. It also is not as cumbersome and ugly to use for EI as one of those XL blades, which tend to be a little bit on the girthier, heavier side and less fun to use for EI. Anyway, other cutting that I did was water bottles, pool noodles. It did all those things reasonably well. I whacked water bottles, and it cut reasonably well. I'm not used to the size. It's too short for me, so I kept cutting with the tip and drawing that through the target, but still, at the same time, it cut those targets reasonably well, and I didn't notice any issues. I cut through the neck of some bottles, didn't see any issues with edge deflection, anything that suggested that the edge had a problem or that the blade was bending. And so that's good. A lot of times the neck of bottles can leave chips in differentially hardened edges, or it can roll them. I didn't see that happen, and that's not an abusive thing, but frankly, it's known to ding swords, and it didn't happen in this particular case. Otherwise, it cut through bottles just fine. I didn't have problems being accurate, and it was fun to cut through pool noodles. It popped them apart actually reasonably well, and I was able to get horizontal cuts, which are not something that I typically am able to do. It was kind of able to pop the pool noodles apart. It's a testament to that the sword can cut and has a sufficient edge to do it. The other bit to note is that while I was outside, I whacked it against my stand. Differentially hardened swords are known to take a set, and this one, light taps on my stand to medium taps on my stand, didn't bend the sword. It wasn't until I kind of swung it enough to kind of jostle this 6x6, which my stand is made out of, to bend the sword, and even then it took a slight bend. It wasn't hard to bend it back, but it will certainly bend. It will take a set. That's commonplace for differentially hardened blades. It wasn't easy to get it to do that, and I wanted to test that out because I've seen some other videos with this sword, and it looks like in some cases it's taken a set easy, and that wasn't the case that I have had here. I don't know if there's some variation in the tatami, the technique, or what have you, but it took some pretty hefty whacks on the side of my stand with the intention of bending it to get it to bend. I didn't notice any other issues throughout the course of using it. All right, sword friends, I've showed you the bits and bobs and fits and features. I've talked about build quality. I've talked about moving it around as a practitioner and cutting with it. Hopefully you have what you need to decide if it's worth your hard-earned money or not. But it's time I answer that question myself. Is it worth the $1,200 that's being asked on Cult of Athena right now? And The short answer is yes, but it is definitely for a particular kind of practitioner. If you're somebody that wants ultimate durability, your money's better spent elsewhere. If you want something light as a feather that's going to do the work for you in tamashigiri, again, this blade is not for you. But if you like the really, really well done fittings, if you like the fact that the handle is shaped really well for a practitioner, particularly with sausage fingers like mine, if you like the fact that it has a folded steel blade that brings out some of the character that you might see on an antique, if those are things that you enjoy and you want them in one package, along with something that's going to feel substantial in the hand, something that's going to make you work for your techniques in EI, or not do the work for you when it comes to cutting, but is there to do the work, I think this offers a really compelling package, and it is quite a stunning looking sword. $1,200 is not nothing, and there's certainly opportunity for improvement here, but I still think you're getting a lot for the money. Anyway, my vote would be yes, but you have to value those things. If you don't, then it's not for you. And I get the feeling a lot of people that watch this channel want ultimate durability, or want something that's going to be easy to cut with. And this is just not one of those swords. If you're an experienced practitioner, I think it might help you go to the next level, or bring something new to the table that you haven't had before. But you have to value those things in order to find value in this one. Or you can just like the way it looks, because it is very, very handsome. Anyway, those are the kind of nuanced things that I thought I could bring to the conversation. Hopefully you found it worthwhile. Again, a special thanks to Patrick at Cast Iberia and Cast Iberia in general for sending this my way for the purposes of reviewing. That's all I got. Cheers, and thanks for watching.